Hey everyone, Reed here with Big Strong Book, and today I'm going to be doing a review, not of a book, but of one of my favorite films from the past few years, Dune Part 1. I decided to do this review because in just about a week, Dune Part 2 will be released, and so it was as good of time as any to rewatch Dune Part 1, do a review in preparation for Part 2. I plan on seeing Part 2 soon, and we'll be getting a review up, I think, a few days before the general release. And then once it comes out, the wide release happens on March 1st, I will be doing a spoiler discussion. So I'll recap a bit here of my personal history with the Dune universe, the Duneverse, if you will, and my other history with the films of Denis Villeneuve. So my history with Dune, my knowledge of Dune extends back to right around like late middle school, early high school. I started to get more into science fiction. I'd already been into fantasy, but sci-fi remained kind of elusive. And I had heard about Dune, in particular, heard Dune compared as the science fiction equivalent or the science fiction answer to The Lord of the Rings. So I checked it out. And this happens with quite a few books I read, or quite a few books that I come back to later. I tried to read Dune when I was, I think, a freshman in high school. Tried to read it. I got maybe a fifth of the way through and it just wasn't clicking. So I put it down and then reapproached it about a year later and read through the whole thing and really enjoyed it. And then I started to read Dune Messiah, the second book, and I think the change of, not only the change of pace that Dune Messiah has, but just the radical shift in the story wasn't something I was even ready for then. And so my history with Dune, as the book series, it begins and ends with just that first volume. I've read the first volume. I deeply respect it and appreciate it, and still someday I want to be able to get through certainly the 6 original books that Frank Herbert wrote. And of course, after reading the book, that's when the knowledge came about of, or at least I heard about, the various adaptations that have been done of Dune over the years. The David Lynch film from 1984. I've seen bits. I still haven't seen that in its entirety. I've seen scenes and bits and pieces of it. David Lynch is one of my favorite film directors of all time. That is one of his few films that I have not seen. I always find the story funny of when there's a video somewhere online of David Lynch talking about when George Lucas approached him to direct Return of the Jedi. And during I can't really do a good David Lynch impression, but he said that he constantly had a headache just in the conversations that he had with George Lucas, and then Lucas took him to the production office where he showed him, well, David Lynch remembered them as Wookiees. They were probably Ewoks, but showing him like concept art and design for the movie, and it just, it was so foreign to Lynch's true sensibilities as an artist, and I understand that, and he actually told George Lucas, why don't you direct this? Because of course George Lucas, even though he directed the original Star Wars, he did not direct Empire or Jedi. Remained as a producer and writer, although I think it's debatable as to that his influence may have really been that of a director. But so David Lynch turned Lucas down to direct Return of the Jedi, and then when Dino De Laurentiis called for Dune, Lynch agreed because his agent kind of chastised him for turning down what would have certainly been millions and millions of dollars, assuming he would have gotten a pretty lucrative back-end deal, which he probably could have gotten even a small piece of the action. So David Lynch directed Dune. And it's my understanding that the Lynch version of Dune has become something of a cult classic. It adapts the whole book into just a 2 hour movie, uh, which which is why I'm glad, the Denis Villeneuve adaptation is what it is, because I just, 2 hours, cramming all of that into 2 hours is, I think, too much. Then there was, I think, the Sci-Fi Channel adaptation in the early 2000s. They did Dune, and then also adapted Messiah and Children of Dune. I haven't seen any of those. Um, However, now I'll get into my history with Denis Villeneuve. This would have been a little bit after Sicario came out. I didn't see Sicario in theaters, but I saw it shortly after it came out and really enjoyed it. And it it was very intriguing, and and I wouldn't have really, in but Villeneuve's name as a filmmaker, as a director, it still it wasn't something where I walked out of that saying, oh my gosh, what great direction, I need to watch all of Villeneuve's other films. It wasn't like that. Then Arrival came out in 2016, and I saw that in theaters and was um like Sicario, I was very impressed by it. But it wasn't until Blade Runner 2049 came out in 2017 that his Villeneuve's powers as a filmmaker really became apparent to me. Seeing Blade Runner 2049 in IMAX on opening night was, in terms of my theater going experiences, probably the best I think I ever had. Blade Runner before was one of my favorite films, and I know I've talked about this on the channel before, but Blade Runner, one of my favorite films, and then going into 2049, hoping that it would at least be passable and it wouldn't be a complete, failure, because that was the worst case scenario, was reviving a property that turns out didn't need to be revived, and where the new film adds absolutely nothing of value to the original. And 2049 is, I think, one of the examples of a sequel that arguably surpasses the original, or is at least equal to it. That's a hill I will die on. I think 2049 is arguably superior to the original, or to the final cut of Blade Runner. And I think it was at that moment where I was very excited to see and on board with whatever Villeneuve had on his plate in the future. And I remember around the time that he was doing press for 2049, he was talking about his love for Dune. And I was thinking, man, wouldn't that be cool if he did something like Dune? That would be really fascinating. And it must not have been that long after Blade Runner 2049 came out that Legendary, I think, and Warner Brothers announced that he would be helming a new film adaptation of the book, and that it would be a two-part adaptations, kind of splitting the book down the middle and doing two, long movies in order to pay the greatest theatrical respect possible to the source material. And I just, the idea of him in control of Dune excited me, because Sicario, Arrival, and Blade Runner 2049, it was better and better and better. And I was so excited to see Dune, and I was following along with all the news as they went into production in 2019. And I remember as the cast list came out, Timothy Chalamet and Rebecca Ferguson and Oscar Isaac and Stellan Skarsgård and Jason Momoa and Javier Bardem and and as all of these names were being announced, I'm like, oh my gosh, this cast is stellar. Like, it's just the cast seems so it was perfect, or damn near perfect, across the board. Zendaya, I'm probably forgetting names, right? Dave Bautista, all from the major characters to the minor characters, it was, there were no misses on the casting at all, I thought. And again, was keeping track of it. And then I think leading into 2020, I realized, oh no, they're only making part one. And so whether or not we're going to get the complete adaptation is entirely dependent on the success of the first one. I was under the impression, I think, at the time, that they would do a Lord of the Rings approach where it would be a multi-part, or in this case a two-part story, and that they would film both parts simultaneously and then release one year and then release the next the following year. I thought that that's what they were going to do, and I got really nervous thinking, because I was so confident with the cast and crew involved that there's a very good chance, there wasn't a guarantee, of course, there never is a guarantee, but that there was a pretty good chance that it would be a very good film. But if it doesn't appeal to the mass audience, or to a general movie going audience, the middle America, so to speak, or middle America, I mean, but of course movies can often, especially blockbusters, can live or die by the North American box office reception. If it didn't appeal to the average moviegoer, or if it didn't resonate and strike a chord, there probably wasn't going to be a part two. So then, of course, COVID delayed the movie, and then 2021 came around, and it was real, it was happening. Then the other part that got me nervous was when Warner Brothers, for their 2021 strategy, I think all of their theatrical releases were given a simultaneous release in theaters and on HBO Max and it was a simultaneous release for about the first month or so that the movie was out. That had me really nervous again, because I was like, well, the average moviegoer, if they're given a choice between watching a movie in the comfort of your own home, you don't have to go out, you don't have to, jump through a whole lot of hoops, even though it's, for most people, I'm sure, not that much of an ask to go to a movie theater. Watching from the comfort of your own home, where you might have a decent home theater setup, versus having to go to a movie theater and pay extra. If you're already paying for HBO Max, just watch it there. So I was worried that the movie would not recoup or make enough in its box office receipts for Warner Brothers to greenlight a part two. But then, of course, a couple weeks before the movie came out, apparently Warner Brothers talked to Denis Villeneuve, and they said, hey, if this has great numbers on HBO Max, if it's like pretty decent in theaters, but it gets a great viewership on HBO Max, we'll greenlight the sequel. So it's not solely dependent on the box office numbers. So that made me feel a little bit better. Then the reviews came out, and then opening night or somewhere thereabouts, I went to see Dune in IMAX. And kind of like with 2049, I just had a grin on my face the whole time, because it was so on point, so locked in, but there was that fear, because when I went to see it, part two wasn't greenlit yet. So I was like, oh, I think this is really good. But if, and then it was just the but if part two isn't greenlit or isn't made, then part one is going to be just a sad movie. Like, you're not going to want to rewatch it, because it's just going to remind you that they never completed the story. But, and I'll get into the movie now, I guess, 15 minutes after I started this. But anyway, I just had to rehash that to kind of put you in the frame of mind that I was when I went to see this in theaters a few years ago. I just, again, the cast is wonderful. I know with Timothée Chalamet, I, of course, knew of him, hadn't seen him in much prior to Dune Part 1. But I just, when I was seeing those, the trailers and the promotional stuff, I'm like, no, he is Paul, just as arguably as Kyle MacLachlan looked in the Lynch version. Like, Timothy Chalamet is Paul. Like I could see that with all of the characters. None of the characters, struck a bad chord. And even seeing the movie itself, I think one of the bigger criticisms of, particularly with Jessica in the film, is that she kind of assumes this role of a weepy mother. But I think those are in part, valid criticisms, but it she I think the viewers could be pulled in more to her perspective and to her vulnerability. Likewise, Oscar Isaac, phenomenal as a Leto, and Stellan Skarsgård as the Baron. He's not the guy who's all hooped up on drugs and whirling around and has his cat like in the Lynch version, but he's menacing and cold. And I it was definitely a bold choice on the part of Villeneuve, the production designers and the concept artists, costume designers, makeup, all of the ideas and the collaboration that went into determining the look of all of these characters. The boldness in respect to have the Harkonnens be, completely hairless and bald. But it works. You have to. That's kind of the line, no pun intended, but the line in the sand that you have to draw between the Atreides and, as we're probably due to see in part two, House Carino, and with the brutal realities and the brutal existence of Gady Prime. So I was on board with that, and I guess this review isn't addressing the negatives. It's tough because I think this is an adaptation that just absolutely nails it. I should mention that I am not as close to the source material as many of you might be. I read the book about 10 years ago. And and I haven't read it I've read parts of it, but I haven't read it in its entirety since. So I am probably gonna, I went out of part one. I'm probably gonna go out of part two with different takeaways than somebody who has read these books, numerous times over the years, or somebody who, where it's been a part of their life for decades too. They're going to go into it with different hopes and expectations than I will, where I have read the book, so I know and I remember the track of the story, but it's not so tied into who I am even. But I also, another note I have to make is Hans Zimmer's score. I haven't done a whole lot of listening into the other, I think they're called the sketchbooks, the other albums that came out in addition to the film soundtrack, but kind of the, other music he composed for these worlds around the same time, but that weren't used in the movie. Hans Zimmer, his love for the material comes through immediately, just it's hard to describe. It's not Hans Zimmer's usual, big synths and blaring horns and whatever. And Hans Zimmer is a very talented composer, but it's almost like he had been waiting for decades for this kind of a project. And it is a project that means so much to him, given the fact that he was himself a big fan of the books as a teenager. And that's what I love about the creative crew behind this, because Denis Villeneuve, he's talked about respecting and loving the book since he was a teenager. For Hans Zimmer, it was a part of his coming of age too. They were able to resonate with Paul and with his journey. Even, of course, Greg Fraser's cinematography. So much has been said, He won an Oscar for it, for crying out loud. And I was worried at first when the movie came out, because I was hoping and almost expecting Roger Deakins to be the DP on the movie, but he wasn't. And I don't think at the time I had seen other films that Greg Fraser had been the DP for, but nevertheless, I was blown away. And a lot of this ties to seeing it in IMAX. I really believe that with films like this, it they'll say it, and people say it on social media time and time again, this is the way to see the movie, this is the only way to see it. And for a lot of these, I think it really is the case, and it does make a difference in how you walk away from the movie. If your first experience with Dune Part 1 was seeing it, you know on a home theater system, it might not have resonated. I really do think if you're seeing it in a good IMAX theater, it really makes a difference, and it adds to the experience of it. And that experience is what you take away with you as you leave the theater, and it remains with you. And the same is true for me. Like, I think of scenes like the harvester scene in the film, where they have Liet Kynes and kind of the whole group of them go out into the desert to observe the harvesting in action, and then the sandworm comes, and it's just, that scene was perfection to me. Just the way of building it up, and the choppy editing at some places as Paul goes out and he's kind of lost in this trance and in this vision. um I it where I said, where I had the grin on my face the whole time, that was the case, particularly with that scene. And then another one, just as I rewatched this recently, the scene where, this is all going to be spoilers too, but where Paul and Jessica flee from the Fremen stronghold, or if that's an ecological empire lab. I think it's not a Fremen outpost. It's part of like the Empire's scientific work, where it's Paul and Duncan Idaho and Liet Kynes and Jessica, and at least in the movie, they go to this place. If I remember correctly from reading the book, it's like an ecological laboratory, not a Fremen stronghold. But I might be wrong. It might be a Fremen outpost. But as they leave in the ornithopter and go out into the sandstorm, and Paul sees the vision of Jamis, and he learns to just let go and move with the process, as they say in the movie, and just go into the flow and let it guide you. With Paul just trying to let go, and then the added element of that, and I'm just very intrigued to see how they're going to address it in part 2, or how they will extend it, is Paul's fear of becoming this type of leader where people kill in his name, and where he's almost deified. And it's the intrigue. I'm sure Paul has the intrigue, but he also has the fear. But he just has to flow through the process, and he fully realizes that at the end, after he kills Jamis and says, "My road leads into the desert. Like, I'm part of this world now." And whether that's to try to prevent, or succeed in being able to topple the Harkonnens and the Emperor, but that there could maybe be some way to avert disaster, as he sees a disaster for himself. Gosh, and I don't even know, what else I can say. Like, the production design, just the feel and the look of everything. One thing I was kind of disappointed by okay, so there is one thing, like, scenes that I have seen from the David Lynch film are of the space navigators, the spacing guild, or whatever they're called. The weird look of those creatures, I don't know if we're going to get the Spacing Guild in part two, but I kind of hope we do. Um, and again, I'm recording this before I've seen part two. I guess this will kind of go into my hopes for part two. Obviously, one of the biggest questions is going to be Aaliyah and what they're going to do with her. I'd wondered about this for a while if they're going to cast like a 5-year old child actor, but then kind of do what they did in the Lynch version, which is dub over the 5-year old. But I know that there was the news that Anya Taylor-Joy is in the film, and now in people's assumptions, I think, is that she's Aaliyah. I don't know that for sure, but I feel pretty confident that that is the case. Um, I again, as I said, I'm not as tied to the source material as some people will be. Uh, so but again, I feel confident in part two because it is a um it is an extension of the first part. It's cast, the crew is pretty much all the same, so I don't have much reason to doubt that this will be something great, even that it will be able to tie part one together into a greater whole. And I get that that's another one of the criticisms of part one was the fact that it was, for better or worse, it was half a story. That this story starts to gain momentum and you feel like you're going somewhere, and then it ends as they walk off into the desert. And we all knew it would be that way. I remember coming out of the theater after seeing part one for the first time, and some people really dug it. I think most people did, just from the conversations that I could hear. And then there were other people who were, the marketing of the movie made it seem like Chani, like Zendaya would be more of a figure in part one, and of course she just appears in some visions strung throughout, and then is just in the last couple of scenes. So that they were disappointed that she didn't have a bigger role in the movie, or that they were led to believe through the marketing that she would have a big role. Even though I thought it was pretty. I mean, if you've read the book, it's clear that she's not going to have much of a role in the first part, but she will have a huge role in part two. I'm looking forward to seeing that, to really seeing, because Zendaya, she's such a great actress, and you know, there wasn't a whole lot of opportunity she had in part one to really showcase her acting chops, because if you've seen her in any TV show or movie, you know what she is capable of. So I'm excited to see that. Likewise, Austin Butler as Fade. Come on. I just, when I heard that, I'm like, all right, yeah. And again, with the part two casting news, Austin Butler as Fade, Florence Pugh as Irulan, even Christopher Walken as the Emperor. I have to say, I kind of took a step back. I'm like, what? His Christopher Walken playing the Emperor never crossed my mind as a remote possibility or a casting choice. But again, I'm excited to see what they do in part two. Likewise, everything with the time change with Leto the Second. What are they gonna do? Is that gonna be just something that is on the cutting, or that was on the cutting floor from when they were even writing the script, that they just decided, hey, let's not go into this in this movie. And then of course, when I leave part two, when I leave the theater, there will still be the up in the air as to whether or not we will get a green light for Dune Messiah. As Villeneuve has said, and he has already started working on the script, he wants to do an adaptation of Dune Messiah to kind of bring the whole story into a trilogy. The trilogy being part one, part two, and Messiah. And I would like to see that, because even though we've seen Messiah on the small screen, we have yet to see anything past the original book on the big screen. So I hope that happens. So yeah, I mean, Dune Part One, in terms of being compared to Blade Runner 2049, 2049 is clearly the superior film, and of course, Dune Part One's success or its ultimate legacy for me is still to be determined. It's whether or not Part Two can stick the landing. I feel confident that it can with the same cast, crew, the same creative talent behind it. I don't have much reason to doubt that it won't stick the landing. Um, but of course, there's always that possibility that it may not. So, uh, Dune Part One, great movie, and hopefully it is a movie that is made all the better by having its second half come out, and so we can see the full 5 hour epic in all of its glory. So let me know what you think of Dune Part 1, and I will see you guys next time.